Well, good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to this debate being put on by the Christian Union here at Cambridge University. It's lovely to see you all here. I'm going to hand straight over to our chair for the evening, who is Sam Block. Sam is the co-director of debating at the Cambridge Union here. I'll also just introduce our speakers first of all. So on your left is Professor Gary Habermas from Liberty University, Virginia in the USA. And on your right is Dr. Arif Ahmed from our very own philosophy faculty. So I'll hand over to Sam straight away.
Many thanks. Okay, good evening, everyone, and many thanks for coming, and welcome to our debate today. The motion that we're going to be talking about this evening is "This House believes that Jesus rose bodily from the dead." The speakers have already been introduced, so it leaves to me just to run you briefly through the format for this evening. First of all, we're going to have 20 minutes lecture by the Speaker for the Opposition, then a 20-minute lecture by the Speaker for the Proposition. Following that, we'll have 25 minutes of discussion between the two speakers, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'd like to call upon the Speaker for the Opposition, Dr. Arif Ahmed, to open his case.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay. I do sometimes tend to start speaking quite quickly and quite quietly, especially at the points of my argument that are weakest. So if any of you notice that, then please shout out, obviously, especially those at the back. Okay, well, I should start by introducing myself and telling you what my views are. I am an atheist, and that means that I don't believe in God. I don't believe in resurrection, either bodily or spiritual. I don't believe in a special providence. I don't believe in a future state, and I don't believe in anything supernatural. Now, when people tell me that they're atheists, they sometimes say something like, "I'm a committed atheist," or "I'm a devout atheist." And maybe it's just meant as a slightly feeble joke, but I wouldn't describe myself as a committed or a devout atheist. That is to say, I don't regard atheism as a position I hold as a matter of faith, nor do I regard it as one that I particularly want to hold or would be willing to continue to hold if the evidence were actually against it. I would quite like to believe in a good God. I'd quite like to believe a number of supernatural claims, and I would particularly like to believe that I'll come back to life after my bodily death. The question is not, however, whether it would be a nice thing if it were true. The question is whether it is true. Now, the issue that we're debating tonight concerns bodily resurrection. And what this means, of course, is that Jesus came back from the dead, not just as a spirit, but as an actual physical body. It was, of course, a rather special physical body, because, as you will know, it was one that was able to pass through walls, as St. John says. And the way in which I'm going to pursue the question, in fact, a way in which I think it's mandatory to pursue the question, is simply on the basis of what empirical evidence there is for settling this issue. Is there sufficient evidence for us to believe that Jesus did rise bodily from the dead, or if there is no sufficient empirical evidence, then we should either suspend belief and remain in a state of doubt, or we should positively believe that the event didn't happen. Now, before I go on to give my arguments, I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I'd like Professor Habermas to answer, if he'd be so kind, in his presentation. We all know that historians should be objective about their sources. That is to say, a competent historian, certainly one whom you would trust, is somebody who takes an attitude at least of skepticism, or if not of skepticism, then at least possible skepticism, towards the documents that concern him and which he treats as his historical sources. I don't know about you, but I've often had the experience when I read scholarly articles of seeing a mass of citations and lots of footnotes and all the other paraphernalia of the scholarly world, finding it quite intimidating. And when I first read it, I think, gosh, this person must really know a lot about what he's talking about, because he's got 48 footnotes, whereas this other guy has only got 12. A similar thing, of course, can happen in spoken debates. So, for instance, somebody might give a talk in which he cites a large number of scholars. He might say 85% of scholars believe this, or the majority of scholarly opinion is this, or I've looked at all the scholarly works on this topic, and they all say such and such. Now, in a case like that, obviously we can't check the claim that's being made. We're not in a position, because we don't have the text in front of us, and even if we did, we wouldn't have the time to check whether the claim that he makes is true. Therefore, we have to take it on trust. And that's why it's so important that a historian needs to be skeptical and objective. If he isn't, there are reasons for doubting what he says, and there are reasons for wondering whether we should indeed take on trust what he's asking us to take on trust. Perhaps the most spectacular example of this is a historian whose name most of you will know. Well, I call him a historian. The person I have in mind is David Irving. Many of you will know that he wrote a number of works in which he didn't deny, but certainly radically underplayed the extent of the Holocaust. Those works were copiously referenced and full of all the sort of scholarly paraphernalia that I've just mentioned. If I read it, or if you read it, or probably if anybody here read it, you would think, well, maybe he's got a case. He certainly looks like an expert about it. But I'm pleased to say that, of course, what he says was nonsense, and I'm also quite proud to say that it was one of my colleagues in the history department here at Cambridge who was partly responsible for exposing the nonsense that it actually was. Now, that's a very dramatic example of a scholar who is not objective about his sources, because, of course, this particular person was driven by the rather wicked beliefs that he had, deliberately to bias and distort the scholarly opinions that he presents. And, of course, lay people will be in no position to check that. So now this gives rise to a couple of very simple questions for Gary. I'm sure he'll be able to answer them, and if he answers them in the way that I expect him to be able to, then this stumbling block is one that we can pass over very quickly. One question is whether he believes the Bible, the original Bible, is inerrant in all respects. If he thinks that everything in the Bible has to be true, I mean, for instance, the seven-day creation, the age of man extending to 1,000 years, the parting of the Red Sea, the statement in Mark that people who believe in Jesus will be able to drink poison without harm. If he believes all of those things and he doesn't doubt any of them, then we have to start wondering just how objective a historical scholar he really is. Now, of course, I'm sure that he is an objective historical scholar. I'm sure he does have some skepticism about some of the historical claims in the Bible, and I'd be grateful if he could tell us just one or two of those claims over which he has these doubts. I'm sure he'll be able to, and I'm not going to go back to the issue if he does. The last thing I'll say on this point is that you might say exactly the same about me. That is to say, you might say, well, look, here's this atheist, isn't he rather arrogant, coming along with all of these claims, and he's got his own atheistic worldview, and he's presenting it. How do we know he isn't going to be biased and distort the evidence? Well, the answer is, the arguments that I'm going to present, at least tonight, are ones that you can all check straight away. They're not based on the consensus of historical opinion, of scholarly opinion, and I only cite, at least in the arguments I'm giving now, I only cite a scholarly article once, and that's one you can very easily check. Let's suppose then that Gary's been able to answer the question that I started by asking him. And let's move on now to the question of the evidence for the resurrection. Now, I'm not going to be concerned particularly, at least not at this stage, with minute analysis of the historical data. I'm going to allow quite wide latitude for what historical data we admit. In fact, I'm going to admit quite a lot. I'm going to suppose, though in fact this isn't true, that we have a great deal of contemporary written testimony about the resurrection. I'm going to suppose, though this isn't true, that the testimony was written by people who were entirely unbiased, all of them, who were skeptical and highly educated, and I'm going to assume that we've got no other reasons for doubting what they say, other than the content of what they say. I claim that even then, we don't have a case for the resurrection that is worth a second look. Now, the first argument for this, I'm going to give three arguments for this claim. The first argument for this claim is the one that's listed as the first argument on your handout. And rather than go through it, I'm going to start by presenting an analogy in order to illustrate it. So let's imagine, in the first case, that you have a pitcher of water, say a bucket of water, and you have a thermometer with which to measure it. Or better, let's imagine not just that you have one, but that you have 4 or 5 thermometers with which to measure its temperature. And you put the thermometers in the bucket of water, and they say that it's 10 degrees C. And you put your hand in, and it feels quite cool, so you think, okay, that's probably right. But now imagine that the thermometers say that the temperature was 30 degrees C. Now, you might put your hand in and think that's a bit odd, because it's quite cool, indeed cooler than I normally feel water at that temperature to be. But nevertheless, maybe it's because there's something wrong with the way in which I detect heat by touch, and probably all of these thermometers are correct.